Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Mets Daily on the Fan Arch Network. John Saponaro here with you today and every day to talk about our New York Mets. But before we get started, a quick shout out goes to our friends over at Kalshi for sponsoring the video for a limited time. Use the code FANARCHBASEBALL on the Kalshi app to get $10 when you trade 10. Weekend is in the books. First half, the unofficial first half of the Major League Baseball season for the New York Mets and for everybody else across the league. Also in the books, and the Mets ended the first half the way they have so often throughout the season in 2026 in embarrassing fashion as they are swept at Citi Field by the Boston Red Sox. Now, on the surface, you might say, hey, Boston's playing better. Boston came in hot. Boston firing on all cylinders. Boston still with a lot to play for despite the record, whereas the Mets are really none of those things. And while that might be true, and while we have resigned ourselves as fans and the Mets themselves as an organization to the fact that 2026 no longer matters, 2026 is in fact a lost year, and we look towards the trade deadline and 2027, I think when you just dig a little deeper into how this series was played and what transpired leading up to it, despite the fact that the Red Sox were playing better, you just can't help but shake your head at what was another embarrassing defeat in what has been a string of embarrassing defeats. And we don't have to get into each particular game and each moment. And quite frankly, there weren't too many moments that you'd want to focus on anyway. But on a Monday morning, looking back at the weekend that was, I think if you just look at this series in totality, it tells you a lot about where the Mets are, where the Mets have been, and in some ways, where the Mets might be going for the rest of 2026 with some of the players on their roster, despite the fact that they might have, 6 players, 8 players, 10 players off of this Major League roster in about a month. And that will hopefully inject some life and some youth. But if some of those players wind up sticking around, I don't see the path to how this gets better, not this season anyway. And again, that's with the backdrop of the season being over, sure. But as I've said so many times on this show already, especially last week alone, I just want to see a representative stretch from the New York Mets. I want to see them do what, we all hope they could do just for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, dare I say a month, so that this season doesn't look completely abysmal record-wise, so that they can really hang their hats on some good play heading into 2027. But if they play like they did against Boston this past weekend, with a mostly healthy team, that is going to be a hard thing to do. Just take another moment here on this series, why it was so frustratingly embarrassing despite everything I just said. Boston arrives at 5 p.m. due to some flight issues on Friday at Citi Field. That game was scheduled to start at 7:10. The Mets, as a courtesy, pushed the start time back to 7:50, gave the Red Sox a little bit of time to settle in, to actually pick up their equipment, which I think arrived about a half hour or 45 minutes after the team did. And I joked on Twitter, I said, the Boston Red Sox are going to get to Citi Field an hour before the game, exhausted and unshowered, and they're going to beat the Mets 8-0. I was close. Go to my Twitter, at John Saponaro, check the tape. Mets wind up losing 6-2. So I got the runs right, just the distribution wrong. But what an embarrassing way. The Mets played so poorly, you would think they were the ones that got to Citi Field 2 hours before the game. You would think they were the ones that spent, I think 6 hours sitting on the flight the night before and then another few hours sitting on the flight the day of. Nope. Boston Red Sox did that. And they came out and they wasted no time, put up some runs right away, never looked back. I'm proud to say, by the way, I watched, I think, 2 innings of this series this weekend. A part of that was because of scheduling. I had some softball games. Part of that was general apathy. I checked out the highlights. I'm always following the game on game day. I listen to a little bit of it in the car here and there, mostly because I have a duty to all of you listeners, viewers, and all the viewers of Till Mets Do Us Part that I do once a week. But I'm happy that I didn't let them suck me in fully and watch what was a terrible series. So then you move on from that embarrassment on Friday night to the embarrassment of Saturday. Saturday's a little bit more status quo, but you've got a young pitcher, not a lot of major league experience coming up, acting as the opener. Might have been his major league debut. I don't even remember. God, it doesn't even matter, right? And then they go to the bullpen game. Mets can't get anything going. Mets leave a million men on base. They don't have a ton of hits, but they got a bunch of walks. They got base runners. They have opportunities. They can't cash in. It's the same song and dance. So maybe not as uniquely embarrassing as Friday, but still an embarrassing experience for the New York Mets. They lose there. And then Sunday, in a way, might be the most embarrassing of the three because the Mets actually have a lead. It's a slim lead. They didn't play a great game. They didn't score a lot of runs, whatever. They have a lead. It's the 9th inning. Devin Williams is on to close. Gets what should have been a ground ball double play to end the inning and the game. Francisco Lindor has had such a weird season in every way, shape, form, idea, concept. Boots the ball. No outs. Couple walks. Blue hit. Tie game. Losing extras. So just Friday night's bad. Saturday night's bad. Sundays may be worse. And again, the Mets just go out with a whimper in the unofficial first half of this season. I don't know about you guys, but I could absolutely use the break. The All-Star break is not just for players to rest and recuperate if they're not playing in the game. It's not just for players and teams to get their second wind and really lock in for the dog days. When you have a team like the 2026 New York Mets and you root for them, it is a reset for the fans. We'll talk a little bit more about the first half of our Mets season in the final segment, but we should touch briefly on the MLB draft, which happened over the weekend. Now, I am not a draft aficionado. I am not a prospect guy. I understand how prospects work. I understand how the Mets prospects are doing because I'm a Mets fan, because I do these shows, I follow along. I'm not the number one top prospect guy, and I'll admit that. I always have. So to that end, I want to let you know, I do not follow college baseball. I do not certainly follow high school baseball, although the Mets did not draft many high school players in this particular draft. So I am not going to claim to be some kind of expert on the potential prospects or the draft picks that the Mets went out and picked up this weekend. But what I can say to you is the Mets made 19 picks in all. They were very pitcher heavy, 13 pitchers to just 6 hitters. So a little bit more than double. And I'll do what I think a lot of people have done so far in the Mets content space, but I think it's a fair way to look at this again, because these, as you get deeper into the rounds of the MLB draft, these are not people that most of us are going to be familiar with, in fairness. And I don't feel qualified to speak on, honestly, even the top 3 picks. But from some of the research that I've done and some of the other great content creators that I've listened to, some of the articles that I've read, I can say a few things. One, the Mets took some big swings on talent here. And if you're not familiar, the Mets picked 3 times in the first 4 rounds, 27th, 92nd, and 120th overall. They selected Carson Wiggins, who's a right-handed pitcher, first. Then they got Aiden Robbins, who's an outfielder. And then they went with Shane, I want to say it's Sadao. It's SDAO, with the 120th pick, a left-handed pitcher. And they really took some swings here on talent and upside. Carson Wiggins is a guy who had the internal brace and full Tommy John elbow reconstruction, which is the same surgery and procedures that Christian Scott had. So he has not pitched in a while, although he is throwing again. He's re-begun his throwing program, pitched at the draft combine, and will probably get out on a mound sometime this summer. So this is a guy who has not thrown a lot, but has a big arm. Was throwing 100 miles an hour when he was 17 years old, which is probably how he blew out his elbow. I'm no doctor, but it just seems like not a great way to approach things. And in his last in his last college appearance prior to Tommy John, which was over a year ago, hit 102 on the radar gun. So this is a guy with a massive arm. He has big time upside. A lot of front offices, the Mets included, look at pitchers that they're going to draft or pitchers that they're going to acquire sometimes from, we're heading into trading season, prospects on other teams, things like that. They look at guys who have already had Tommy John, and they look at that as a quasi-positive because their arm is not on the brink of blowing up. Now, you never know what's going to happen. Certainly, we've seen guys have second and third Tommy Johns. So, anything is possible. But the Mets take a big swing here on a guy with a big arm, and it seems to be a lot of talent, electric fastball, electric slider, and who knows? We're not going to know for years. But that has sort of been the theme of the Mets draft if you listen to people who cover the Mets. Anthony DiComo wrote about it, some other folks as well. That brings me to Aiden Robbins, who's the outfielder. He's a guy who just sort of hits. He's hit his entire college career. You could look up the numbers at Seton Hall. And then he transferred to Texas, a little bit of a bigger school, of course, better program. All he did was hit there. He played in the Cape Cod League, which, if you're not familiar with that, is a great breeding ground, a training sort of league, summer league for these top prospects to go and showcase their skills in. He hit there. So he hit at the small school. He hit at the big school. He hit in Cape Cod where all the top prospects go, all the top, guys who want to get drafted go. So this is a guy who just hits. He grades out pretty average across the board in terms of power and contact and defense and arm strength. Scouts, they rank these guys on a scale where 80 is the max, and he's 50 to 55 in all areas. So he does a lot of stuff really well. I don't know if he does anything excellently, but he is a guy who's got some pop. And interestingly enough, he was a guy that a lot of people had mocked to the Mets at 27. The Mets choose to not draft him in the first round, and there he is waiting for them at 92. So maybe he falls into their lap because other teams don't value him. Probably a little bit of that. Maybe he falls into their lap sheer luck, but the Mets seem pretty excited to get a guy that a lot of people thought they wanted and that they heavily scouted anyway, and they got him, 50-something, 60 picks later, which is amazing. So good for them if it works out. And then when it comes to Shane Sadao, left-handed pitcher, very similar to Carson Wiggins in the sense that, again, big upside guy, big arm, throws 97. He's a guy who had Tommy John a couple of years ago. And then last year, he did not have a great season, pitched to a 7 ERA. I don't know what to make of ERAs in college baseball, but I know 7's not good anywhere. And so again, Mets going for high upside guys with a lot of arm talent, guys with a lot of power. And that was sort of the theme of their draft. The other thing is signability. Because you have to remember, when you're a team like the Mets, you sign a lot of free agents and you go over the luxury tax. There are other penalties that trickle down when you're drafting. And so the Mets really only had about $6 million to work with in terms of signing all of the draft picks that they were going to draft during this weekend. And when you do that, you have to be creative about how you draft sometimes. So it seems like Carson Wiggins is a guy who may be a bit of a reach in terms of where he was mocked, but he's a guy who might sign for under slot value, which means you can get him for cheaper than what the value of that pick would be. But then you look at a guy like Aiden Robbins, and even though the Mets got him later on, he's a guy you might have to sign for over slot value. And again, when you're only dealing with $6 million to sign all of these picks potentially, you really have to be creative about how you go about it. So again, this is not something I claim to be an expert about, and this is not something any of us are going to know about for quite some time. But those are the top 3 picks the Mets made. They went on to make 16 more, and I'm sure we will hear more and more about them as they get into the system. And as prospect gurus, people who really cover this stuff, like Ernest Dove, like Joe DeMeo, start to dive in on these guys as they see them in the system. And of course, they have to be signed first. And we'll probably get some more information too. As the signings become official, more information will trickle down about them. But, in a year where the Mets are terrible, you can't help but look towards the future. And in this sense, the very far future. But in the meantime, baseball season is here, and now you can trade every game on Kalshi. And you know what I do? I sit down, I go to hit record, I pop on over to the Kalshi app first, and I see what I can find that's good value and maybe a little interesting for you to check out yourself. And I think with baseball on a bit of a hiatus, it's on pause, I think the Home Run Derby is a really fun place to look. Now, the Home Run Derby is wild. You don't really know what's going to happen. You've got your favorites, sure, but this is a real wild card situation. So I think there's value in what is a very stacked derby, kind of wherever you want to go. When you look at the favorite, Kyle Schwarber, he's leading the major leagues right now with 32 home runs. He's the favorite, but him to win is only trading at 22 cents a share. So there's good value there. But I think if you dig a little deeper, I would say, if you want to have a little fun, look at the second favorite, Junior Caminero, who earlier this season for the Rays hit 11 home runs in 11 games, went on an absolute tear. Also no slouch, he's got 28 home runs on the season. He's at 18 cents a share, which means $100 will get you $525. You got a little fun money, you got a little pizza money, that might be something you want to look at. And I'll give you a second one as a bonus. The other guy who I find intriguing is across town, Ben Rice with the New York Yankees. He's going to be there in the Derby. He's got 29 home runs on the season. He's trading at 10 cents a share, which means $100 will get you $943. Now, again, the home run derby is tricky. These percentages are all over the place because it's hard to tell. Some guys just show up and they just know how to win a contest like this. Some guys just show up and they can't win a contest like this if their life depended on it, no matter how much of a home run hitter they are or aren't. So I think there's value anywhere. But I like Junior Caminero. I like Ben Rice. On Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there is no house. And as the probability changes, you can trade in and out of your position. For a limited time, download the Kalshi app. Use the code FANARCHBASEBALL to get $10 when you trade 10 Kalshi. Trade on anything. Must be 18 and over. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risks and may not be suitable for all investors. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory. We got to talk a little bit, and we won't spend too much time on him here today, about Freddie Peralta. Because Freddie Peralta over the weekend has another bad start and where he continues to tank his value over and over and over again. But I stand by this as we're going to turn the page firmly into trade season coming up shortly. Freddie Peralta still has a lot of good value in terms of the trade market for the New York Mets. Some of it is because of his reputation. Some of it is because of the position he plays. And some of it is because supply and demand. The market is going to dictate what guys are worth. We could talk about the fact that Freddie Peralta has had a really good career prior to this season with the Mets, Some teams are going to look at it and they're going to say, you know what? He's got the Mets stink on him. This has just been a bad year all around. We get him here. We get him in a better situation. We can fix him. Maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't, but teams are going to value that. The other part of it is starting pitching. Teams just need it. Teams that are good and are in it are going to want to be better there. And there's a lot of teams that are on the fringe that are trying to make the playoffs either for the first time in a long time or for back-to-back years in a long time. Whatever the case may be, a lot of teams that need starting pitching. The Cubs need starting pitching. The Nationals, the Cardinals, the Pirates. There's so many teams that can use another starter. So that brings me to the supply and the demand aspect of this. The other part of it too, the other part of that is that there's not a lot of teams that are so horrendous that they're completely out of it, that they're going to offload their best pitcher. And in that case, if you want to find a silver lining for the Mets being that bad, I guess that's the silver lining. There are not many teams that are so far out of it that have starting pitching to trade. So it is a seller's market. The Mets are going to be in the driver's seat, especially with a weak American League. You just saw the Boston Red Sox, who are not a good team, but have been on a really good run. They're only a few games out of a playoff spot all of a sudden. See the same thing with the Detroit Tigers. You see the same thing all over the American League. Teams are in it, and whether they're contenders or pretenders, who cares? If they think they're in it and they need a starting pitcher, that's going to help. I mentioned the Tigers. Well, what looked like a foregone conclusion, trading Tarek Skubal, now might not be, because this might be their last stand with Tarek Skubal. Now, again, are they true contenders? Probably not. But if there's any chance that they can make the playoffs with a pitcher like this who they know they're going to lose, why trade him now? You were never going to get fair value for him to begin with, not in the offseason, not at the deadline. I know it sucks to lose a guy for nothing, which is what's going to happen. They'll get a comp pick in the offseason when somebody else signs him. But I think he's just more valuable to your franchise if you just try to make a run, try to make the playoffs, try to see what happens. So if you take him off the table, all of a sudden, Freddie Peralta, even with all his baggage, even with his bad year, he might be the best starting pitcher available in terms of talent. So I think when you look at this situation in totality, Freddie Peralta is still probably going to net the Mets a top 100 prospect in baseball. And I know that seems crazy, but I think it's true. I think he's going to be valuable enough that they either get one pretty good top 100 prospect, like, I don't know, between 50 and 75, or they get a guy who's in the top 100 near the end of it, between 85 and 100, let's say, and then another guy, another piece, a lottery ticket piece. And that's going to be pretty good value for a guy who has not had a good season in 2026. Again, we'll talk more about that as the week and the months go along, and certainly once a trade is consummated, because I will say this. At this point, July 13th, Freddie Peralta 100% will not be on the Mets after the trade deadline passes. Lastly, we'll talk about the fact that the first half will kind of bring this individual show full circle. We'll kind of bring my tenure on this show since the beginning of June sort of full circle as the unofficial first half wraps up. All-Star game is here. The All-Star break is here. And we know how bad the Mets have been. But I want to dive briefly into the numbers. I don't like to throw a bunch of numbers at you, but some of them just need to be pointed out for just how unbelievably pathetic this team has been. Mets end the first half with a record of 40-57. There were only 3 teams worse than that. Colorado, who is expected to be bad. Kansas City, who has some talent, but is not a team that has really done anything of note since, well, really they beat the Mets in the World Series in 2015. And Anaheim, who is a perpetual disaster of a franchise. They're so poorly run. They're poorly owned. They're poorly managed. Everything about that franchise is bad. Those are the only three teams that have a worse record than New York Mets. And if you look at the standings across Major League Baseball, they ain't that worse. Of course, the Mets go into the break limping, losing 3 in a row to the Red Sox, which we already talked about. The Mets have a negative 65 run differential. And only the Colorado Rockies and the Kansas City Royals have a worse run differential. That's how bad the Mets have executed when we talk about pitching and scoring runs. Pitching well and scoring runs. And the Mets have not been able to do either one of those consistently, of course. But that run differential is brutal. And this next one is a real telltale sign of just what is a bad team. The home and road splits for wins and losses. The Mets on the road are bad. 10 games under 500, 19 and 29. Bad. That's bad. We've seen Mets teams that didn't make the playoffs because they were so bad on the road and so good at home. We've seen Mets teams that have had good seasons because their home record dragged them to the finish line. The Mets at home this year, 21 and 28. Almost as bad. They are 2 better in the win column and 1 better in the loss column. Home versus road. Put that all together. Put that run differential on top. That's how you have a season like what we've had to endure as fans. And it's terrible. And then you look at some of their team rankings, offensively and pitching-wise. We'll start with the pitching, because despite how bad it's been lately, it's actually not as bad as you might think in some areas. I was surprised. Team ERA, 18th. Runs allowed, 10th. Not bad. Home runs allowed, 15th, middle of the pack. I actually thought that one was going to be worse. Walks allowed, 9th most. That feels right? And saves, which of course is not the most important stat. When you think about how the Mets have blown some opportunities, including last night or yesterday afternoon, and how the Mets have been so bad in one-run games, and the Mets have been so bad at rallying late. The Mets are 29th out of 30th in saves. So that shouldn't be surprising, but it feels stark nonetheless. We'll end on the offense, because the offense has been so bad all season, even when the pitching was going better. Runs, 23rd. Hits, 23rd. RBI, 24th. Average, 26th. On-base percentage. Now, I know one person can't fix your on-base percentage as a team, but remember, this is the baseball team that rosters Juan Soto, who gets on base basically better than anybody else in baseball. He's going to do it roughly 40% of the time. And the Mets on-base percentage as a team, despite that, 29th out of 30. Slugging percentage, again, on a team that rosters Juan Soto, but again, he can't do it all by himself. Slugging percentage, 27th. OPS, which is on-base plus slug, 28th. Awful numbers. And I know, again, I don't like to throw numbers at you, and I know I threw a bunch at you at once. I'm not going to repeat them, because who cares about the particulars? But when I wanted to find a way to end this show to cap off the season, what we've seen so far. And I wasn't sure how to do it. And I said, you know what? Let me just look at some numbers. Let me see if the numbers are as bad as I feel that they are. You know, are they who we thought they were? Men lie, women lie, numbers don't. You are what your record says you are. Is it all of that? And it is. This team is exactly where they belong when you look at all of that. And that's not every number. That's not every stat. It doesn't account for injuries. I understand all that. But when you just look at those numbers that I threw out there, home road splits, run differential, how bad the offense has been, how poor the pitching has been in spots. This is not a fluke. Now, it's not to say that the Mets don't have foundational pieces for 2027. We've talked about that already. They have plenty. It's not to say the Mets don't have the resources to turn it around in a hurry. They certainly do. They have more resources than just about anybody. But like I said earlier in the show, there needs to be a change with something. And I don't know quite what it is yet. A lot of people in the comments will probably say, got fired David Stearns, because that's what everybody says every week, every day. A lot of people are going to say things like, you got to trade Francisco Lindor, and you're going to feel really justified after he makes the error on Sunday. I don't think that's it. But this team is broken. It's broken to the tune of some pretty awful numbers. They asked Devin Williams after the game what he's going to do during the All-Star break. And he said, anything but this. And I think that's accurate. I think it's really telling, too. And my one bit of advice to you guys hanging out, trying to stick with the Mets. I hope you stick with Mets daily, despite how bad this season has gone. But I think over the All-Star break, watch the Home Run Derby. It's fun. Watch the All-Star game if you like it, for sure. Juan Soto's going to be there. But I think you should take Devin Williams' advice. As far as thinking about this 2026 Mets team over the next 3 days, anything but that. That's going to do it for this episode of Mets Daily. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and click the subscribe button. Sitting at over 4,000 subscribers, trying to get to 5,000. We would love for you to be a part of that group. Until next time, I'm John Saponaro. See you tomorrow.